It wasn't until the laughter faded that a cold dread washed over me. I'd gone too far. The look on Mark's face was like a slap, a raw humiliation I hadn't seen flicker across his features in years. But it wasn't his wounded expression that truly chilled me. It was his brother Ethan, leaning back in his chair, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face like he'd been waiting for me to stumble, to expose some hidden weakness. The family dinner had started out perfectly normal, almost idyllic. Mark's parents, radiating their usual Upper East Side charm, were animated, gossiping about their building co-op board and the latest drama with the doorman. I was seated beside Mark, my usual spot, while his younger brother, Ethan, took the chair directly across from me. It had been a while since I'd seen Ethan. He lived upstate, a couple of hours away, and visits were rare. But whenever he did appear, he brought this unsettling energy with him, a kind of magnetic confidence that was hard to ignore. It was impossible not to notice the sharp contrast between him and Mark, even if I tried to deny it to myself. Dinner conversation drifted through the usual safe topics: work, apartment renovations, upcoming birthdays. Then Mark, in a light, almost self-deprecating tone, mentioned the broken dishwasher we'd been battling for weeks. "Just haven't had time to get to it," he said with a shrug, a hint of exasperation beneath the surface. That's when it slipped out. The joke. The one that cracked the polished veneer of the evening. "Well, you're not exactly Mr. Fix-It, Mark," I'd said, a playful smirk playing on my lips as I reached for my wine glass. "Let's be honest, you'd probably call someone to change a light bulb if you could." The table erupted in laughter. Even Mark's mom chuckled, dabbing at her mouth with a linen napkin. But when I glanced at Mark, the smile froze on my face. He wasn't laughing. His face flushed crimson, his lips pressed into a tight, thin line. He stabbed at his perfectly cooked steak with unnecessary force. For a split second, a sharp pang of guilt pierced through the wine-induced haze. It wasn't like me to tease him like that, especially in front of his family. But the Pinot Grigio had loosened my tongue, and the words had tumbled out before I could catch them. But it wasn't just Mark's reaction that snagged my attention. It was Ethan's. He was lounging back in his chair, arms crossed, that same slow, knowing grin spreading across his face. His eyes darted between Mark and me, like he was watching a scene unfold that he already knew by heart. "Come on, Sarah," Ethan said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth, laced with a teasing edge. "You've been with Mark long enough to know he's not exactly a handyman. Some of us are born to be brains, not brawn." It was meant to diffuse the tension, I think, but the way he said it, the way his eyes lingered on mine as he spoke, made my skin prickle with unease. The conversation moved on, the chatter resuming, but Mark remained silent for the rest of the meal. I tried to catch his eye, to offer a silent apology, but he wouldn't meet my gaze. When dinner ended, Mark retreated to the living room with his dad, leaving Ethan and me to clear the table. I could feel Ethan's presence as he moved around the kitchen, his casual confidence making the air feel thick, heavy. "You really hit a nerve," Ethan said, breaking the strained silence. I glanced up from the sink, startled. "What are you talking about?" He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his gaze steady, almost unnervingly direct. "Mark, he doesn't like being called out, especially not in front of Mom and Dad." I frowned, setting down a delicate china plate I was rinsing. "It was just a joke." "Sure," Ethan said, his lips curling into that same unnerving smirk he'd worn at the table. "But jokes like that, they stick. Especially when they come from someone like you." "Someone like me?" I asked, narrowing my eyes, a knot of defensiveness tightening in my stomach. He shrugged, pushing off the counter and moving closer, invading my personal space. "Come on, Sarah, you know Mark idolizes you. He's always trying to live up to whatever impossible standard he thinks you've set for him. A comment like that, it hits where it hurts." I opened my mouth to argue, to tell him he was reading too much into it, but the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, I knew he was right. Mark's insecurity about his lack of practical skills, his perceived inadequacy, had always been a sore spot, and I'd poked at it without thinking. "You should go talk to him," Ethan said, his tone softening, almost becoming concerned, before it turns into something bigger. "Yeah," I muttered, grabbing a dish towel and drying my hands, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling Ethan's words had stirred within me. "I'll do that." As I turned to leave the kitchen, I felt Ethan's gaze linger on me, a heat in his eyes that made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't quite decipher. When I found Mark in the living room, he was slouched on the expensive leather couch, arms crossed tightly over his chest, staring blankly at the oversized T-screen. His dad was talking, droning on about something financial, but Mark wasn't listening. His jaw was clenched, his eyes distant. "Hey," I said softly, sitting down beside him, trying to bridge the chasm that had opened up between us. He barely glanced at me. Hey. I leaned in closer, lowering my voice so his dad couldn't overhear. About earlier, I didn't mean to embarrass you. He didn't respond, his eyes still fixed on the screen, his body rigid. Mark. I tried again, placing a hand gently on his arm. I'm sorry, okay? It was just a joke. I didn't think... That's the problem, Sarah, he said finally, his voice low but sharp, cutting through the air like shattered glass. You didn't think. His words stung, but I didn't push back. I knew I'd hurt him, and arguing wouldn't fix it. So I just nodded, giving his arm a gentle squeeze. I'll make it up to you, okay? Mark sighed, finally looking at me, though his eyes were still clouded with hurt, a deep resentment simmering beneath the surface. I'm going to bed, he muttered, standing abruptly. It's been a long day. I watched him walk away, the guilt twisting tighter in my chest, a cold knot of dread forming in the pit of my stomach. Back in the kitchen, Ethan was finishing up the dishes, humming softly to himself. He glanced at me as I walked in, raising a questioning eyebrow. How'd it go? He's upset, I said, grabbing a glass of wine from the counter, needing something to steady my nerves, and taking a long, fortifying sip. I think I really hurt him. Ethan didn't say anything at first, just watched me as I leaned against the counter, the weight of the evening pressing down on me, suffocating me. He'll get over it, he said finally, his voice low, almost dismissive. Mark's always been good at pretending things don't bother him, even when they do. There was something in the way he said it, something almost smug, possessive. I looked up at him, meeting his gaze, and for a moment the air between us felt charged, electric. Don't look so guilty, Sarah, Ethan said, his lips curling into that familiar, unsettling smirk. You're human. You've got needs. Sometimes those needs don't line up with what you've got. I opened my mouth to respond, to protest, but the words caught in my throat, choked by a sudden, unexpected realization. For the first time, I saw that Ethan wasn't just being his usual cocky, subtly provocative self. He was testing me, and a terrifying, thrilling part of me didn't want him to stop. When Mark went to bed, slamming the bedroom door behind him, I thought the night was finally over, the tension released, however uncomfortably. I had no idea it was just beginning, that Ethan was about to cross a line I never expected, or maybe, deep down, even wanted him to. The house had fallen silent after dinner, the only sound the low hum of the city outside. Mark was locked away in the bedroom, his presence as distant and cold as the tension still crackling in the air between us. His parents had retreated to their guest room upstairs, leaving just Ethan and me in the dimly lit living room. I poured myself another glass of wine, the liquid trembling slightly in my hand, and sat on the couch, staring at the flickering TV screen, but not really watching. My mind was replaying the dinner, over and over again, like a broken record. The look on Mark's face when I made the joke. The way Ethan had smirked at me, like he'd been anticipating some kind of explosion, some kind of crack in the facade. The guilt was heavy, suffocating, but so was the frustration. Mark had always been so sensitive about certain things, his insecurities about not being manly enough, about not being able to take charge the way his younger brother so effortlessly could. And maybe that sensitivity wasn't entirely his fault, but I was tired of tiptoeing around it, of constantly managing his fragile ego. I didn't notice Ethan walk in until he was standing beside me, a bottle of beer in one hand, his other casually tucked into the pocket of his jeans, that unsettling confidence radiating off him in waves. "Still up?" he asked, his voice low, but edged with a strange amusement. I shrugged, swirling the wine in my glass, the ruby liquid catching the dim light. Couldn't sleep. He nodded, taking the armchair across from me, sinking into it with that same easy, effortless confidence he always seemed to exude. "Mark turned in early, huh?" "Yeah," I said, taking another sip of wine, the bitterness momentarily grounding me. Ethan watched me for a moment, his gaze steady, thoughtful, almost probing. "You know," he said, leaning back in his chair, the leather creaking softly, "Mark's always been like that, runs off to brood when things get tough." I frowned, setting my wine glass down on the marble coffee table with a soft thud. "He's not brooding." Ethan raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smile playing on his lips, a knowing, almost condescending smile. "If you say so." A beat of silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, the only sound coming from the muffled drone of the TV. I shifted uncomfortably under Ethan's intense gaze, the weight of it making my skin prickle, a strange mix of anxiety and something else, something I didn't want to name. "Look," I said, breaking the quiet, the silence becoming unbearable. "I know I shouldn't have said what I said at dinner. It was a stupid joke, and I didn't mean to hurt him. Didn't you, though? Ethan asked, his voice soft, almost a whisper, but pointed, like a knife sliding between my ribs. I blinked, startled by the directness of his question, the unsettling accuracy of it. What's that supposed to mean? He shrugged, taking a slow sip of his beer, his eyes never leaving mine. Just saying, sometimes people don't say things like that unless there's some truth behind it. I opened my mouth to argue, to vehemently deny it, but the denial died on my lips. Because deep down, a shameful voice whispered that Ethan wasn't entirely wrong. I hadn't meant to deliberately hurt Mark, but there was a part of me, a frustrated, resentful part, that was tired of his insecurities, that wished he could be more confident, more assertive, more like... I stopped that thought before it could fully form, before it could take shape in my mind, but Ethan must have seen it flicker across my face, the unspoken comparison, the forbidden desire. You don't have to pretend with me, Sarah, he said, his voice lower now, almost intimate. I see the way you look at him, and... He paused, his gaze intensifying, locking onto mine, the way you look at me. My breath caught in my throat, a sudden, sharp intake of air. Ethan, don't! I'm just being honest, he said, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees, closing the distance between us, making the air in the room even thicker, more charged. You're not happy. Anyone can see that. The air between us felt thick, heavy, charged with unspoken desires, forbidden possibilities. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, to scream that I was happy, that he didn't know what he was talking about, but the words wouldn't come. They were trapped in my throat, strangled by the truth that resonated in his words, the truth I had been desperately trying to ignore, to bury deep down. Ethan tilted his head, studying me, his gaze intense, like I was some kind of intricate puzzle he was trying to solve, piece by piece. You know, he said, his voice soft, almost seductive, but laced with something dangerous, something thrilling. It doesn't have to be this way. What are you talking about? I asked, my voice trembling, barely above a whisper, fear and anticipation warring within me. I'm saying, he said, leaning back in his chair again, that unsettling smirk returning to his lips. You deserve better. Someone who sees you, who knows what you need, someone who can handle you. My heart was pounding now, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. My hands gripped the edge of the couch cushion, knuckles white. Ethan, stop. Why? He asked, his gaze locked on mine, piercing, unwavering. Because you're scared I'm right? Or because you're scared of what might happen if you admit it? I'm married to your brother, I said, the words barely audible, a desperate plea, a fragile shield against the dangerous current pulling me under. And he said, his tone calm, almost casual, like we were discussing the weather, does he make you happy, Sarah? Really happy? The question hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating, a suffocating truth. I wanted to scream at him to stop, to make him disappear, to erase the dangerous thoughts he was planting in my mind. But the truth was staring me in the face, reflected in the dark intensity of his eyes. Ethan stood, moving to sit on the couch beside me, closing the last sliver of space between us. He was close now, too close, his presence overwhelming, intoxicating. Ethan, I said again, my voice trembling, the word a weak protest, a desperate attempt to cling to the crumbling walls of my resolve. This isn't right. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before gently brushing a strand of hair away from my face, his fingers lingering just a little too long against my skin. You don't really believe that, he murmured, his voice husky, seductive. My breath hitched, caught in my throat, as his hand moved to my cheek, his thumb brushing against my skin, sending shivers down my spine. His touch was gentle, almost reverent, but it ignited a fire within me, a long dormant flame flickering to life. This isn't about Mark, he said softly, his voice a warm caress against my ear. This is about you, what you want, what you need. For a moment, I let myself lean into his touch, my eyes fluttering shut, surrendering to the forbidden temptation. His hand moved to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair, pulling me closer. His lips were so close now I could feel his breath against my skin, warm and intoxicating. Every rational thought in my mind was screaming at me to stop, to pull away, to run, but I didn't. I couldn't. When his lips brushed against mine, it was tentative, hesitant, almost questioning, as if he was giving me one last chance to pull away, to retreat back into the safety of my marriage, my life. But instead, I leaned in, a desperate, reckless surrender, my hands finding their way to his chest, his shirt warm and soft beneath my fingers. The kiss deepened, and all the guilt, all the frustration, all the carefully constructed walls I had built around myself melted away in the heat of the moment. Ethan's hands were firm but gentle, his touch igniting something in me I hadn't felt in years, a long-forgotten spark of desire, of passion. "Tell me to stop," he murmured against my lips, his voice thick with restraint, a barely leashed hunger. "I couldn't," I whispered, my fingers tangling in his hair, pulling him closer, deeper into the kiss. "Ethan." That was all the permission he needed. I told myself it was just one moment, one kiss, one bad decision, a momentary lapse in judgment. But when Ethan pulled me closer, his breath hot against my neck, whispering forbidden words in my ear, I knew I wasn't going to stop. Not this time. The kiss deepened, became more urgent, more demanding, and everything else disappeared. The guilt, the fear, the terrifying reality of Mark asleep just down the hall, completely oblivious to the betrayal unfolding in his own home. Ethan's hands moved with a newfound confidence, sliding down my sides, his touch igniting a fire within me, a wild, reckless flame I hadn't felt in years. I knew it was wrong. I knew I should have stopped it the moment his lips touched mine. But there was something about him, his intensity, the way he looked at me, like I was the only person in the world, that made it impossible to pull away, to resist the forbidden allure. "You're incredible," Ethan murmured, his voice rough with desire as his lips trailed down my jawline, sending shivers of pleasure racing through my body. "Ethan," I whispered, my hands gripping his shoulders, a desperate plea, a last feeble attempt to regain control. "We can't." He pulled back slightly, just enough to look me in the eye, his gaze dark, smoldering with want. "Then tell me to stop," he said, his voice low, a challenge, a dare. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Because the truth, the terrifying, exhilarating truth, was that I didn't want him to stop. He didn't wait for me to respond, for the words that wouldn't come. His lips found mine again, more insistent this time, more demanding, his hands sliding under the hem of my shirt, his touch firm, his fingers warm against my skin. I couldn't hold back the soft gasp that escaped my lips, a sound of surrender, of desire. "God, Sarah," Ethan murmured, his voice thick with restraint, his breath hot against my skin. "You have no idea how long I've wanted this." His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt my resolve crumble completely, shattering into a million pieces. My hands moved instinctively, slipping under his shirt, my fingers trailing over the hard lines of his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart against my palm. "Tell me you don't feel it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes searching mine, pleading, demanding. "Tell me you don't want this as much as I do." "I can't," I admitted, my voice trembling, the words torn from my throat. A confession, a surrender. The air between us was electric, charged with unspoken desires, forbidden longings. The tension was unbearable, exquisite. Ethan pulled me closer, his lips moving down to my neck, his teeth grazing my skin, sending sparks racing through my body, igniting a wildfire within me. I arched my head back, my breath hitching, surrendering completely to the forbidden pleasure. My mind screamed at me to stop, to think about Mark, about the devastating consequences, but my body refused to listen. I'd been starved for this kind of attention, this kind of connection for so long that it felt like drowning and finally, desperately breaking the surface, gasping for air. Ethan's hands moved with purpose, sliding under my shirt and lifting it over my head, his movements confident yet unhurried, as if he was savoring every moment, every touch, every breath. His lips found my collarbone, then lower, his kisses branding me, claiming me. "You're perfect," he whispered, his voice raw with desire. I felt exposed, vulnerable, laid bare, but in a way that made my heart race with a terrifying, exhilarating excitement. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen, truly desired. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a tiny voice of reason whispered about the danger, the catastrophic consequences. Mark was just down the hall, asleep, completely unaware of the betrayal unfolding in his own home. The thought should have stopped me, should have brought me crashing back to reality, but instead, it only added to the illicit thrill, the forbidden rush. Ethan lifted me effortlessly, carrying me to the couch and laying me down gently, his weight pressing against me, grounding me as his lips found mine again, more fiercely this time, more possessively. "Tell me this isn't what you've been wanting," he said, his breath hot against my ear, his voice thick with passion. I couldn't lie to him, not now, not in this moment of reckless abandon. "It is," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper, a confession of a long-held secret desire. Time seemed to blur after that, dissolving into a haze of sensation. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered word felt electric, like I was waking up after years of being asleep, coming alive in his arms. Ethan moved with a confidence that left me breathless, his hands exploring every inch of me, like he was memorizing the shape of my body, claiming every curve, every secret place. For the first time in so long, I wasn't thinking about responsibilities or appearances or what was expected of me. I was just alive. When it was over, we lay tangled together on the couch, the room quiet except for the sound of our ragged breathing, the faint hum of the city filtering through the closed windows. Ethan's arm was draped possessively over my waist, his fingers tracing lazy circles on my skin, sending shivers down my spine even in the aftermath. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice gentle, almost tender. I nodded, though my chest felt tight, constricted, with a confusing mix of emotions I couldn't quite name, a tangled knot of guilt, desire, and a strange, unsettling sense of liberation. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely audible, a breathy whisper. He tilted my chin up, his eyes searching mine, probing, questioning. "I don't regret it," he said firmly, his voice leaving no room for doubt. I wanted to tell him I didn't either, to echo his words, to cling to the warmth of his touch, the intoxicating afterglow of our forbidden encounter. But the words caught in my throat, choked by the sudden, overwhelming weight of what we'd just done, the devastating consequences looming on the horizon. Somewhere down the hall, I heard the faint creak of a floorboard, a subtle shift in the silence. My heart stopped, a sudden sharp jolt of fear, my breath caught in my throat. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice trembling, panic rising in my chest. Ethan sat up slightly, his body tense, alert, as he listened, his head cocked to one side. The house was silent again, the only sound the distant city hum, but the sense of unease lingered, a cold premonition settling in my stomach. "It's probably nothing," he said quietly, brushing a strand of hair from my face, his touch now laced with a new, unsettling tenderness. But as I lay there, my body still pressed against his, the warmth of his skin a stark contrast to the icy dread creeping through my veins, a gnawing feeling of certainty began to take hold. Because deep down, I knew this wasn't going to stay a secret for long. I thought we'd gotten away with it, that we'd managed to keep our transgression hidden in the darkness of the night. But the moment Mark showed me the photo, the grainy, damning image on his phone screen, I knew he hadn't just stumbled upon the truth. He'd been planning his revenge, meticulously, coldly, from the second he saw us, or perhaps even before. The next morning, the house felt different, heavy with unspoken accusations, thick with a silence that screamed louder than any argument. The air was charged, electric, and every little sound, the creak of the floorboards, the ticking of the clock, made me jump, my nerves frayed and raw. Mark had already left for work by the time I woke up, his side of the bed cold and undisturbed, which wasn't unusual, but something about it felt off, final. Ethan was gone too, vanished before dawn, slipping out quietly, like a thief in the night, leaving no trace of his presence except the faint, lingering scent of his cologne on the couch cushions, a ghost of our forbidden encounter. I spent the day trapped in a suffocating fog of guilt and anxiety, desperately trying to push the memory of the night before aside, to convince myself it was a mistake, a one-time lapse in judgment, a fleeting moment of madness. But every time I closed my eyes, Mark's face flashed before me, the wounded, distant look he'd worn at dinner, the cold fury simmering beneath the surface. And the guilt twisted tighter, a relentless, agonizing knot in my stomach. Mark came home late that evening, his expression calm, almost eerily so, but unreadable, a mask of carefully constructed neutrality. He kissed me on the cheek, the gesture mechanical, devoid of warmth, and muttered something about having a long day, his voice flat, emotionless. We ate dinner in near silence, the clinking of forks on plates the only sound breaking the heavy, oppressive quiet. I tried to start a conversation, asking about his day, forcing a lightness into my voice I didn't feel, but he responded with short, clipped answers, his eyes fixed on his food, avoiding my gaze. By the time we were done with the strained, agonizing meal, I couldn't take it anymore. "Mark," I said, my voice trembling, the word a desperate plea for connection, for understanding. He looked up, his expression still carefully neutral, but a flicker of something cold, something dangerous, glinted in his eyes. "What? Are you okay?" I stammered, the question sounding weak, pathetic even to my own ears. He tilted his head slightly, a sardonic smile, devoid of humor, curling his lips. "Why wouldn't I be?" I opened my mouth to respond, to explain the fear gnawing at my insides, the terror of the unknown. But before I could speak, he stood, picking up his plate and taking it to the sink. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost theatrical, as if he was buying time, carefully choosing his next words, preparing to deliver a carefully rehearsed blow. When he finally turned back to me, his eyes were colder than I'd ever seen them, glacial, devoid of all warmth, all emotion. "You tell me, Sarah," he said, his voice calm, chillingly controlled, but sharp enough to cut through steel. "Should I be okay?" My stomach twisted painfully, a cold, sickening lurch. "Mark, what's going on?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, unlocking it with a swift, decisive swipe of his thumb. He didn't say a word as he set it on the table in front of me, the screen facing up, the damning image illuminated in the dim light. And then I saw it. The photo, blurry, grainy, but unmistakable. Me and Ethan, tangled together on the couch, his arms wrapped around me, my face pressed against his chest. The image was a brutal, undeniable accusation. My breath caught in my throat, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear the words Mark said next, his voice low, dangerously quiet. "How long?" he asked, the question hanging in the air between us like a death sentence. "Mark," I whispered, tears already stinging my eyes, blurring my vision. "I can explain." "I don't want your excuses," he snapped, his voice finally cracking, the carefully constructed calm shattering, revealing the raw fury beneath. "I want the truth. How long?" "It was just once," I said quickly, desperately, my voice trembling, pleading for him to believe me, even though I knew, deep down, it was a lie. "It was a mistake, Mark, I swear, a mistake." "A mistake?" he repeated, his eyes narrowing, his nostrils flaring with barely contained rage. "A mistake is forgetting to turn off the stove. This is betrayal." I tried to stand, to move closer to him, to bridge the ever-widening chasm between us. But the look he gave me stopped me in my tracks, freezing me to the spot. It was a look of utter contempt, of disgust, of a pain so deep it seemed to radiate off him in waves. "You humiliated me, Sarah," he said, his voice deadly quiet, each word a venomous dart. "In my own home, with my brother." "I didn't mean for it to happen," I said desperately, tears streaming down my face now, hot and uncontrollable. "I wasn't thinking." "You weren't thinking?" he repeated, his lips curling into a bitter, mocking smile. "That's your excuse? You weren't thinking?" I broke then, the carefully constructed facade of composure crumbling completely. The tears spilled over, a torrent of guilt and shame, as I buried my face in my hands, sobbing uncontrollably. "I'm sorry, Mark," I choked out, the words muffled by my hands. "I'm so sorry." For a long, agonizing moment, he said nothing, just watched me, his expression cold, calculating, devoid of all emotion. And then he laughed, a short, humorless sound that made my chest ache, a sound that was far more terrifying than any shout, any scream. "Sorry doesn't cut it, Sarah," he said, his voice harder now, devoid of all warmth, all compassion. "You didn't just ruin our marriage, you destroyed this family." I looked up at him, my vision blurred with tears, my heart shattering into a million pieces. "Please, Mark," I begged, my voice cracking, raw with despair. "We can fix this. We can go to therapy. We can—" He held up a hand, silencing me, cutting me off mid-sentence. "There is no we anymore," he said firmly, his voice final, irreversible. "You made sure of that." The rest of the evening was a blur of pain and recrimination. Mark didn't yell, didn't scream, didn't rage. He didn't need to. His words, delivered in that chillingly calm, controlled voice, cut deeper than any outburst ever could, tearing through me, shredding my soul. And by the time he left the room, retreating into the icy silence of our bedroom, I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving me gasping for air, suffocating in the wreckage of my own making. I spent the night curled up on the couch, staring blankly at the ceiling, the city lights painting shifting patterns on the walls, my mind racing, replaying every moment, every decision, every mistake I'd made. But the worst part wasn't Mark's reaction, the cold fury in his eyes, the devastating finality in his words. It was knowing that this was only the beginning. The true fallout, the full extent of the damage I had inflicted, was still yet to come. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Mark's voice coming from the kitchen, the clatter of dishes, the low murmur of conversation. I sat up, my heart pounding, a cold dread washing over me as I realized he wasn't alone. When I walked into the kitchen, my legs heavy, leaden, Mark was sitting at the table with his parents. His father's face was grim, set in hard lines of disapproval. His mother's eyes were red and swollen, rimmed with dark circles, like she'd been crying for hours. They all looked up when I entered, and the weight of their collective judgment hit me like a physical blow, crushing me beneath its force. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, the words catching in my throat, choked by fear and shame. Mark didn't answer. Instead, he slid his phone across the table, the photo of me and Ethan still displayed on the screen, the grainy image a brutal indictment. "You tell them," he said, his voice ice cold, devoid of all emotion, chilling the room to its core. As I stood there, paralyzed by fear and shame, my hands trembling, my chest tight with panic, I opened my mouth, trying to find the words, any words, to explain, to apologize, to somehow undo the devastation. But no words came out. They were stuck in my throat, choked by the enormity of my betrayal. Mark's father was the first to speak, his voice heavy with disappointment, laced with a deep paternal sorrow. "Sarah, how could you?" "Dad, no." Mark cut in, his voice sharp, laced with a raw, visceral anger. "No excuses, no lies. You tell them the truth, Sarah, or I will." The words spilled out then, a torrent of shame and regret, tumbling from my lips in a broken, desperate rush. My voice cracked and faltered as I tried to explain, to justify the unjustifiable, but there was no explanation that could make it better, no justification that could undo what I'd done, the damage I'd inflicted. By the time I finished, my voice hoarse, my body trembling, Mark's mother was sobbing openly, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with grief. His father just shook his head, his expression one of utter disgust, of profound disappointment. "You're unbelievable," Mark said, his voice low but filled with venom, each word a poisoned dart aimed directly at my heart. "I hope it was worth it, Sarah, because you've destroyed everything." As I stood there, my world crumbling around me, shattering into pieces, I realized he was right. There was no going back, no fixing this. Mark didn't just want to punish me. He wanted to burn everything to the ground, to obliterate every trace of our life together. And as I sat across from Ethan later that day, watching him take the brunt of Mark's fury, the full weight of the catastrophic consequences crashed down on me. I realized, with a chilling certainty, just how much worse this was going to get. By the time Mark called Ethan later that day, summoning him back to the apartment like a condemned man, I knew it wasn't going to be a civil conversation. I'd heard him pacing in the bedroom for hours, his voice sharp and clipped as he raged on the phone, demanding Ethan come over, his fury escalating with each passing minute. Mark didn't even try to mask his rage, his words growing colder, angrier, more venomous with every syllable. "Tonight," I heard him say, his voice a low growl before slamming the phone down. The pit in my stomach grew heavier, a lead weight dragging me down into a dark abyss of fear and despair. I wanted to beg him to stop, to plead with him not to drag Ethan into this escalating drama, to try and salvage something, anything from the wreckage. But I knew better. Mark wasn't interested in calming down, in de-escalation, in forgiveness. He wanted retribution, pure and simple, and he wasn't going to stop until he got it, until he'd extracted his pound of flesh. Ethan arrived just after sunset, the fading light casting long, ominous shadows across the living room. His familiar confidence, the easy swagger that usually defined him, was gone, replaced by a palpable tension, a tightly wound anxiety I'd never seen in him before. He didn't greet me, didn't even acknowledge my presence as he walked into the living room, his jaw tight, his eyes flicking briefly toward me, a fleeting glance filled with a mixture of apprehension and something else, something I couldn't decipher, before landing on Mark, who stood near the window, silhouetted against the city lights, his arms crossed, a statue of cold, unyielding fury. "So Ethan," Mark said, breaking the suffocating silence, his voice low and sharp, laced with a dangerous edge, "what's this about?" "You know damn well what this is about," Mark snapped back, his control finally cracking, the simmering rage erupting to the surface. Ethan glanced at me again, his expression unreadable, a mask of stoicism before turning back to Mark. "Look, don't you dare try to explain this away." Mark cut him off, stepping closer, invading Ethan's space, his voice rising with each word. "You think I don't know what happened? You think I don't have proof?" For a moment, no one spoke, the tension in the room suffocating, thick enough to choke on. The air was so charged, so heavy with unspoken accusations, raw emotions, that it felt like I couldn't breathe, like my lungs were collapsing. "I'm sorry," Ethan said finally, breaking the silence, his voice steady but quieter than usual, a stark contrast to Mark's explosive fury. "I didn't mean for it to happen." Mark laughed, a bitter, humorless sound that echoed through the room, devoid of all warmth, all sincerity. You didn't mean for it to happen? That's your excuse? You seduced my wife in my own home, betrayed your own brother, and now you're going to stand there and pretend it was some kind of accident, some kind of mistake? The word dripped with sarcasm, with contempt. I'm not pretending anything, Ethan said, his tone firmer now, his voice regaining some of its usual strength, pushing back against Mark's rage. I take full responsibility for my part in this. But this isn't just on me, Mark. Mark's eyes darkened, narrowed to slits, his fists clenching at his sides, his knuckles white. Oh, don't worry, he said coldly, his voice laced with venom. Sarah isn't getting off the hook either, but you're my brother, my family, and you betrayed me. Mark, please, I said, stepping forward, my voice trembling, pleading for reason, for an end to this escalating conflict. This isn't helping, You don't get to play peacemaker, Sarah, Mark snapped, turning on me, his fury momentarily shifting its focus, the heat of his rage scorching me. You don't get to act like you're above this, like you're somehow innocent, when you're the one who started it, who threw the first punch, who detonated the bomb that blew our lives apart. His words hit me like a physical slap, knocking the breath out of me, sending me reeling. I shrank back, my chest tightening with guilt and shame, the weight of my actions crushing me. Ethan stepped forward, placing himself between Mark and me, his voice calm but firm, a protective shield against Mark's wrath. If you want to be angry, Mark, be angry at me. I'll take it. I deserve it. But don't drag her through this. Don't use her as a scapegoat just to make yourself feel better, just to justify your own pain. Mark's eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting back to Ethan, his anger intensifying, fueled by Ethan's words, by his perceived interference. Oh, you'd love that, wouldn't you? He sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. To swoop in and play the hero, to protect the damsel in distress, to make her think you're the better man, the savior in shining armor. But here's the thing, Ethan, you're not. You're just a selfish, arrogant bastard who's been taking what isn't his since the day you were born. The words hung in the air, heavy and toxic, cutting deeper than any punch could have, a brutal, visceral attack aimed at the core of Ethan's being. Ethan's jaw tightened, his hands balling into fists at his sides, his body rigid with suppressed fury. But he didn't lash out, didn't retaliate, didn't give Mark the satisfaction of a physical confrontation. I didn't come here to fight, Mark, he said quietly, his voice strained but controlled. I came here to fix this. Fix this? Mark repeated, his voice dripping with disdain, with utter disbelief. You can't fix this, Ethan. You can't undo what you've done. You can't fix her. He shot me a cold, withering glance, his words like daggers, piercing through my already shattered defenses. I felt tears welling up in my eyes again, a fresh wave of guilt and shame washing over me, but I blinked them back, refusing to let him see my weakness, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break down completely. I had no right to cry. Not now, not after everything I'd done. The argument escalated from there, Mark's voice growing louder, angrier, more accusatory, each word a fresh wound, a deeper cut. Ethan, in contrast, remained remarkably calm, his voice measured, his words chosen carefully but firm, unwavering in his resolve. You think I wanted this to happen, Mark? Ethan asked, his voice sharp, tinged with a hint of desperation, a flicker of pain beneath the stoic facade. You think I planned this, orchestrated this betrayal? Do you really think I would deliberately hurt you like this? I don't care what you wanted, Mark shot back, his voice a roar, his face contorted with rage. What I care about is that you crossed a line, Ethan, a line you can't come back from. You violated the most sacred bond we had, the bond of brotherhood, the bond of family, and there's no forgiveness for that. And what about Sarah? Ethan countered, his gaze flicking toward me again, a silent plea for understanding, for recognition of my role in this unfolding tragedy. What about the fact that she's been miserable for years? What about the fact that you've been so busy controlling every aspect of her life, so consumed by your own insecurities and your need for power, that you didn't even see her slipping away, didn't notice the slow, agonizing death of our marriage? Mark's face darkened, his features twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. For a moment, I thought he was going to hit Ethan, to finally unleash the pent-up fury in a physical assault. But instead, he stepped back, his hands trembling with barely contained rage, his body shaking with the force of his emotions. Get out, Mark said finally, his voice low and cold, devoid of all warmth, all emotion. What? Ethan asked, his voice quiet. almost questioning as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing, couldn't comprehend the finality of Mark's words. "You heard me," Mark said, his eyes blazing with a cold, unwavering fury. "Get out of my house. Get out of my life. You're not my brother anymore." Ethan hesitated, his jaw tightening, his expression a complex mix of anger and sadness, of defiance and defeat. He looked between me and Mark, his gaze lingering for a moment, searching for something, some sign of hope, some flicker of reconciliation. "Mark, don't do this," he said, his voice softer now, a desperate plea for reason, for sanity. "Don't let this destroy everything." "It's already done," Mark said, his tone final, irreversible, a death knell for our fractured family. "You made your choice, Ethan. Now live with it." For a long, agonizing moment, Ethan didn't move. He just stood there, frozen, his shoulders tense, his expression a mask of pain and regret. Then, without another word, without another glance in my direction, he turned and walked out the door, his footsteps heavy, defeated. The sound of the door slamming shut echoed through the silent house, a deafening finality, the sound of a life, a family irrevocably broken. The silence that followed was unbearable, oppressive, heavier than any sound could ever be. Mark didn't look at me, didn't say a word, didn't even acknowledge my presence as he turned and walked back to the bedroom, leaving me standing there alone, broken, adrift in the wreckage of my own making. I sank onto the couch, my head in my hands, my body racked with sobs, my chest tight with guilt and regret, the weight of my actions crushing me beneath its unbearable burden. I'd thought the worst was over, that the revelation, the confrontation, the argument was the climax of this unfolding tragedy. But I was wrong. It was only just beginning, because Mark wasn't just cutting ties with Ethan. He was cutting ties with me too, severing the bonds that had once held us together, and I had no idea how to stop it, how to salvage anything from the ashes of our destroyed life. Mark wasn't yelling anymore, wasn't pacing, wasn't making threats. He was calm, quiet, methodical, and somehow, that was worse, far more terrifying than any outburst of rage. It was the silence, the cold, calculated silence that told me this was the end, the irreversible dissolution of everything we had built together, and no amount of apologies, no amount of tears could ever change that devastating truth. The house felt impossibly quiet after Ethan left, the sound of the door slamming shut still echoing in my ears, reverberating through the silence, amplifying the emptiness. I couldn't bring myself to move from the couch, paralyzed by guilt and fear, trapped in a suffocating web of my own making. My chest felt tight, constricted, my stomach twisted in knots of anxiety and regret. Mark had gone to the bedroom without another word, retreating into his fortress of ice silence, leaving me alone in the living room with my thoughts, my guilt, and the sharp, agonizing realization that I had burned everything to the ground, reduced our life together to ashes. I sat there for hours, unmoving, staring at the blank TV screen, the flickering city lights outside casting long, distorted shadows across the walls, too afraid to move, too afraid to face Mark, to confront the full extent of the wreckage of what was left of our marriage. It wasn't until close to midnight that I finally worked up the courage, the desperate resolve to go to him, to try one last time, to salvage something, anything from the ruins. I opened the bedroom door slowly, tentatively, half expecting to find him already asleep, lost in the oblivion of unconsciousness, but he wasn't. Mark was sitting on the edge of the bed, his back to me, his shoulders slumped, defeated. His phone sat on the nightstand, casting a faint glow across the room, and I could see the faint pulse of a message notification, a silent witness to the unraveling of our lives. "Mark," I said softly, stepping into the room, my voice barely above a whisper, a fragile plea for connection, for understanding. He didn't respond, didn't move, his body rigid, unyielding. I took a tentative step closer, my heart pounding in my chest, a frantic drumbeat of fear and desperation. "Please, say something." When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost resigned, devoid of all emotion, all hope. "There's nothing left to say," he said, the words hanging in the air between us, heavy and final, like the closing of a coffin lid. His words hit me harder than I expected. A physical blow to the chest, and I felt tears sting my eyes again, hot and uncontrollable. "Mark, I'm sorry," I choked out, my voice breaking, raw with despair. "I know that doesn't mean much right now, but I—" "Stop," he said, cutting me off again, his voice sharp, laced with a weariness that was more devastating than anger. He turned to look at me then, finally breaking the silence, his expression unreadable in the dim light. but his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. A complex mixture of anger, disappointment, hurt, and something else. Something colder, more final, something that resembled detachment. I don't want to hear it, Sarah. Mark, please, I said, my voice trembling, pleading, desperate. We can fix this. We can try. We can... He stood abruptly, the sudden movement startling me, sending a jolt of fear through my body. Fix this, he repeated, his voice cold, laced with sarcasm. How do you fix something like this, Sarah? How do you come back from this betrayal? I opened my mouth to respond, to offer some desperate platitude, some empty promise, but the words caught in my throat, choked by the enormity of his pain, by the devastating truth of his words, because I didn't have an answer. There was no easy fix, no simple solution to the cataclysm I had unleashed. Mark began pacing the room, his movements restless, agitated, his hands on his hips, his head bowed like he was trying to collect his thoughts, to find some semblance of order in the chaos of his emotions. You didn't just betray me, Sarah, he said finally, his voice low but steady, each word a measured blow. You betrayed us, everything we've built, everything we've shared. And with my own brother, Sarah, my own brother. I know, I whispered, my voice breaking again, the words barely audible, choked by sobs. And I hate myself for it. But I didn't mean for this to happen, Mark. I wasn't thinking... That's the problem, isn't it? He said, stopping his pacing to face me, his eyes piercing, accusatory. You weren't thinking about me, about us, about what this would do to our family, to our lives. You were only thinking about yourself, about your own selfish desires, your own fleeting moment of pleasure. The silence that followed was deafening, oppressive, broken only by my ragged breathing, by the silent tears streaming down my face. I wanted to say something, anything, to bridge the vast chasm that had opened up between us, to offer some glimmer of hope, some promise of reconciliation. But the weight of his words crushed me, silencing me, leaving me speechless, defenseless. Finally, Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair, his gesture one of utter exhaustion, of profound defeat. I can't do this anymore, Sarah, he said, his voice quieter now, softer, but no less final. My heart sank, a cold, sickening plunge into the abyss of despair. What are you saying? I whispered, my voice barely audible, a desperate plea for him to deny the inevitable. I'm saying I need space, he said, his voice flat, emotionless. I can't look at you right now, Sarah. I can't look at this house, this life we've built together, not after what you've done. Mark, please, I begged again, stepping closer to him, reaching out a trembling hand, desperate to touch him, to reconnect, to bridge the impossible gap that separated us. Don't do this. Don't throw everything away. Please don't destroy us. I'm not the one who threw it away, he said sharply, his eyes flashing with a sudden surge of anger, his voice regaining its cutting edge. He grabbed a small duffel bag from the closet, his movements quick, jerky, and began tossing clothes into it, his actions deliberate, final. Where are you going? I asked, my voice trembling, fear gripping my heart, squeezing the breath from my lungs. To my parents, he said without looking at me, his voice flat, emotionless. They deserve to know what's going on. They deserve the truth. And what about me? I asked, tears streaming down my face now, hot and uncontrollable, a torrent of despair. Mark paused, his hand gripping the zipper of the bag, his body rigid, unyielding. That's up to you, he said finally, his voice devoid of all emotion, all connection. Figure out what you want, Sarah. Figure out what you're willing to live with. Then he zipped the bag shut, slung it over his shoulder, and walked out of the bedroom, leaving me standing there alone, shattered, adrift in the ruins of our destroyed life. When the front door closed behind him, the sound echoing through the silent house, it felt like a final blow, the death knell of our marriage, the irreversible end of everything we had once shared. I stood in the middle of the bedroom, my chest heaving, my hands shaking uncontrollably, as the full, devastating reality of what had just happened, of what I had done, finally sank in, crushing me beneath its unbearable weight. Mark was gone. Ethan was gone. And I was left alone, adrift in the ruins of my own making, with nothing but the ashes of our destroyed life, and the crushing weight of my own guilt and regret. The next few days passed in a blur of grief and isolation. Mark didn't call, didn't text, didn't reach out in any way, and I didn't dare reach out to him, paralyzed by fear and shame, trapped in a self-imposed prison of guilt. I spent most of my time sitting in the living room, curled up on the couch, staring blankly at the empty space where Ethan had kissed me, where everything had started to unravel, where my life had irrevocably changed course. I thought about calling Ethan, about asking him why he'd left so easily, why he hadn't fought for me, for us, for whatever fragile, forbidden connection we had forged in the heat of the moment. But every time I picked up the phone, my fingers hovering over his number, I froze, paralyzed by indecision, by fear, by the overwhelming uncertainty of the future, because I wasn't even sure I wanted him to answer, wasn't sure what I would say, what I would do if he did. When Mark finally called, it was almost a week later, the silence stretching into an unbearable void, amplifying the emptiness of my life. "I've spoken to my parents," he said, his voice flat, emotionless, devoid of all warmth. "They know everything." My stomach twisted painfully, a cold knot of dread tightening in my gut. "Mark, I've also spoken to a lawyer," he said, cutting me off, his voice leaving no room for argument, for reconciliation. "I'm not filing for divorce. Not yet, but I want a separation. I need time to figure out what I want." The line went quiet for a moment, the silence stretching between us, thick and heavy, suffocating. Before he added, his voice barely audible, a ghost of a whisper, "You should use the time to figure out what you want too, Sarah." Then he hung up, the line going dead, leaving me alone with the echoes of his words, the crushing weight of my own uncertainty. After the call, I sat in silence, his words echoing in my mind, a haunting refrain. Figure out what you want. The truth was, I didn't know what I wanted. I didn't know if I could fix things with Mark, if there was any possibility of reconciliation, if I even deserved to try, after what I'd done. I didn't know if there was a future with Ethan, or if what we'd shared had been nothing more than a fleeting moment of weakness, a reckless act of self-destruction. All I knew was that I couldn't keep living like this, trapped in this suffocating prison of guilt and regret, paralyzed by indecision, weighed down by the crushing weight of my mistakes. That night, driven by a desperate need for change, for escape, for some semblance of clarity, I packed a small suitcase, filling it with the barest essentials. I didn't know where I was going, didn't have a destination in mind, but I knew I needed to leave, to get some distance, to clear my head, to try and find some answers in the vast, unknown expanse of the future. As I stood in the doorway of the apartment, the weight of everything I'd lost, everything I'd destroyed, pressing down on me, suffocating me, I took a deep breath, the air filling my lungs, a fragile breath of hope amidst the ruins, and stepped outside into the cool night air, leaving behind the wreckage of my old life, venturing out into the uncertain darkness of the unknown. It wasn't freedom, not yet, but it was a start. A tentative, uncertain step towards something, anything that might resemble a future.